Hi, I'm Adam Levitt, co-editor of Camera UK, and welcome to tonight's webinar titled Forced to Apologise, the BBC's Role in Spreading Misinformation on Gaza. Now, those who follow Camera out there, I know there's a lot of you, and who follow our content know full well the systemic anti-Israel bias at the BBC, both at their English and their Arabic sites. In fact, just last week, Camera was proud to publish a 33-page report titled BBC Arabic, News or Propaganda, which addressed over 4 years of content produced by that Arabic branch of the BBC World Service. In fact, late last September, Camera UK and Camera Arabic were pleased to contribute to a comprehensive report compiled and edited by Danny Cohen, a former director of BBC Television, concerning the BBC coverage of the war between Israel and Hamas. We also contributed to a report in early September by Trevor Asserson, who quantified the number of times BBC violated its own editorial guidelines during the 4-month period beginning on October 7th, 2023. Asserson's team actually counted over 1,500 violations of their own editorial guidelines in that 4-month period. But more recently, the BBC was revealed by our guest tonight to have aired a documentary that literally spread Hamas propaganda. So I'm going to give you a brief timeline to catch those up who aren't up to speed. In mid-February 2025, the BBC began promoting a documentary set to be aired on BBC Two, with viewing available on BBC iPlayer for an additional 11 months. The synopsis of that film, titled Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, described it as a dramatic documentary. Here's the BBC's synopsis, just to give you a sense of what they were presenting. Following the lives of 4 young people trying to survive the Israel-Hamas war as they hope for a ceasefire, a vivid and unflinching view of life in a war zone. To make this film, 2 producers based in London remotely directed 2 cameramen on the ground in Gaza over 9 months, gaining access to key locations out of reach to foreign press. The dramatic documentary sheds a new light on life inside Gaza's humanitarian safe zone, showing everyday life with ongoing airstrikes and efforts to keep people alive in its only functioning permanent hospital, Al-Aqsa. Now, the program aired February 17th at 9 p.m. UK time on BBC Two, only in the UK. Now, after watching the BBC film, investigative journalist David Collier immediately researched some of the claims, and the following day he published a post at his blog which included some truly shocking revelations. Number 1, the BBC failed to reveal that the 14-year-old fluent English-speaking boy named Abdullah, who narrated the film, was in fact the son of a Hamas minister, or deputy minister, and since he was a young boy, actually had been trained with his fluent English as a child propagandist for years for Hamas. The BBC also failed to reveal that one of the UK-based directors was living in Gaza until 2024 and is a professional pro-Palestinian propagandist. Also, David revealed, one of the Gaza-based cameramen had praised deadly terror attacks on social media, including praising even the October 7th massacre. So BBC allowed itself to be used as a propaganda platform for a prescribed terror group, a group that's prescribed in its entirety in the UK and other countries. Now, on February 19th, 2 days after the revelations by Collier, BBC issued a clarification on its website, apologizing narrowly for their failure to reveal that the narrator's father was in fact a high-ranking Hamas official. On February 20th, Camera UK documented a mistranslation in the promotional video published on the BBC News website on February 15th, with comments by another boy featured in the documentary being mistranslated. The boy had said Yahud, which of course in English means Jews, but BBC mistranslated it to Israelis. On February 21st, with the story of BBC's malfeasance exploding, the corporation issued an update to its previous statement and removed the program entirely from BBC iPlayer pending due diligence. Now, on February 25th, the Telegraph published research by Camera Arabic documenting additional mistranslations of the documentary, whereby they mistranslated, or rather erased, the word jihad and changed it to prepared for battle. On February 27th, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, an organization dedicated to fighting anti-Jewish hate, held a protest outside BBC headquarters. That same day, calls for an independent inquiry were raised in Parliament. And on March 4th, the BBC Director General and the BBC Chairman appeared at a select committee meeting, with the latter calling for an independent review of the corporation's Middle East coverage. That same day, the House of Lords discussed the row. Now let's turn to our guest. I'm going to give a brief introduction of David Collier. Collier is a British investigative journalist and a researcher specializing in anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist activities. In 2017, Collier was recognized by the Allgemeiner as one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. In 2022, Camera honored him with a Portrait of Courage Award. Now, Collier continues to be an active voice against anti-Semitism, contributing to various platforms and engaging in public discourse to shed light on issues affecting Jewish communities worldwide. And of course, most recently, David was the journalist who exposed this huge story, which continues to blow up, about the BBC literally spreading Hamas propaganda. Now, before we welcome David, I just want to remind those watching that you'll be able to ask questions for David by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now, let's turn over to David. I'd like to welcome you. Welcome, David.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for inviting me on.
Okay. All right. So, a few questions before we get to the Q&As from those watching. There's a few things I'd like to know. So, if you could explain a little bit how you first flagged the problems with the documentary and how long it took you to figure out that the boy's father was a Hamas official.
All right, well, I mean, you and I have both been doing this quite a long time. So I knew there was a problem with the documentary before it had aired. I knew there was a problem because it was a BBC documentary, and we know the way these things are put together. So I watched most of it. I started actually looking at some of the issues before the documentary had finished. It took me about 3 hours to realize that there was a major problem, and probably about 5 before my jaw was dropping. I couldn't believe that they'd made such a catastrophic error as this one. So about 5 hours from start to finish.
Okay, and how did you actually figure out that the boy's father was a Hamas deputy minister? Like, go through the mechanics of that for us.
Okay, I mean, I spend a lot of time using Facebook for this kind of an investigation because you can flesh people out on Facebook. You can turn them into 3D. You can look at their family. You can see, learn a lot about them. So I took the boy because the boy was the narrator. He was the key figure, and I tried using image recognition software on him. And surprisingly, I got a hit from last November, from November 23rd, 2023, from a Channel 4 documentary. So Abdullah's been around for a while, and he's been on our screens for a while. Channel 4, it turns out, used him 3 or 4 times. Anyway, the piece on Channel 4 named him and showed us his father. So I took his father and I used reverse image technology on him as well. And I got hits on the father. And the father was the director of Adamir, which is a PFLP aligned NGO. And okay, so I found his Facebook page. So I'm going through the timeline of his father's Facebook page, and I see an image of Abdullah. I think, okay, well, this is logical. But he called him his nephew and he named him, which meant the Channel 4 piece in November had misnamed him and assigned him with the wrong father. So I now had Abdullah's actual full name. And it was a case of trying to triangulate a relationship between Abdullah's uncle and the surname that he'd given Abdullah, to try to find a link between those two families. And I found one. Abdullah's father had tagged Abdullah's uncle into a post. And at that point, I just went into what I now believed was his father's Facebook page, and it's all over. He's proudly advertising himself as part of the Hamas government. It was that easy. It really was.
Now, let me ask you, because like you said, we've both been doing this a long time, and it's been my experience that sometimes it's hard to predict when a post or a tweet is going to go viral or going to make an impact, and in your case, actually impact public policy, possibly. Were you surprised at how the story exploded, both in the media, in the mainstream media, and within the government?
Not this time. Not this time. I actually have messages that I sent out just after midnight. I didn't go to sleep that night because I was checking and double checking. I was thinking I must have made a mistake somewhere. But I have messages that I sent out about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. to people, just OMG. You know, I knew at that point that this was the kind of thing where you know the BBC are not going to get away with it. They're nailed. So I didn't look. I'll be honest. I didn't foresee they'd be talking about it in Parliament within a few days, but I certainly knew it was a big story.
Okay, and let me ask you this: how would you grade the BBC's response to your expose to date in terms of
Um,
accountability and transparency?
look, I look. I've as someone who's been chasing them for quite a long time, as you, there was the good. There is a feel good side to this. I can't pretend that I'm completely, because they've been nailed. As look in the beginning, I was worried. I spent those first few hours actually concerned that I had made a mistake. Most of the press reporting about my expose was careful about how they're wording, just in case I had made a mistake. And it wasn't really until the BBC began to respond that I realised, yeah, okay, I have got it 100% right. It took them far too long to pull it down, far too long. I mean, the very case that they did not know, the BBC did not know internally, or their executives did not know, that the person they had used as an orator was the son of a senior Hamas official. If they did not know that, then they cannot possibly have any faith at all in the rest of the production. As soon as they realized they'd made that mistake, that catastrophic a mistake, they should have pulled it down. 100% for sure.
Okay, so I know it's really hard to predict what's going to happen, but sometimes within the work we do, there's a tipping point. Do you think there's any chance that this might be a tipping point and the BBC might enact or might be coerced to enact real reform, the kind of reform that will actually impact their egregiously biased coverage of Israel and anti-Semitism?
Look, I'm a bit of a pessimist here.
Yeah.
Um, I don't believe that the BBC are capable of internal reform. That's the bottom line. I think they're too far gone. Certainly, their Middle East desk, BBC Arabic, the whole mechanism that reports. I mean, I don't know what it's like BBC in Brazil. I don't, I just know about the BBC in the Middle East and in Israel. It's so far gone; it is beyond repair. So, if anything is going to happen, it is going to be forced from without. Do I believe it will happen? I don't know. I can't answer that question. I hope so. I really do hope so. But it would basically mean stripping the BBC's, at least the Middle East reporting side of it, stripping it back and just rebuilding it completely.
Hmm. So you think that's all that can be done at this point is just to rebuild it? Like there's no, you think like a,
Yeah, I mean it's more than a mindset. It's ingrained now into the entire system. They have an engine room full of people climbing over themselves looking for new ways to demonize Israel. That's what they have. The people coming along just pushing these. Can I write this? Can I do this? Can I write this story? Can I do this story? That's the engine room, and we see the result every day in these new articles that turn up. So no,
well,
I don't believe it's
no.
possible.
People often ask me, like, as you know, I spent a lot of time, way too much time, if you ask me, monitoring The Guardian over the last 15 years. And people ask me what the difference is. And I said the difference is that the BBC is a public broadcaster, that their license fee from, Britons in the UK pay for the content. And they're also gigantic in a way that The Guardian could only hope to be, right? They broadcast in some 40 different languages. They're by far the biggest public broadcaster in the world, maybe the largest English media outlet in the world. And their influence is just beyond anything that the Guardian can hope to. I mean, the Guardian has a lot of views, but typically Guardian readers are Guardian readers, right? Whereas the BBC, I think, and it'd be interesting to see what people in the US think. But my sense is that when they see BBC, they think that's the stamp of approval, that's a brand that they could trust. So would you agree part of the problem is that the BBC still has this level of like credibility that has no correspondence with the content, at least when it comes to the Middle East.
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, you're right. I mean, I remember as well, Sifwatch, comment is free from The Guardian. I remember those days. um, Showing my age now. Yeah, I mean, look, there's no comparison, I think, between the BBC and almost anything else. It is considered pretty much the gold standard. And you can see automatically when an article is published on the BBC, it goes viral and it gets reposted by outlets all over the world, which you wouldn't have with something like The Guardian. The BBC is the gold standard. It is, and you're right in the sense that in this day and age, the truth hasn't yet caught up with it. It's still held up as a gold standard, even as we watch the decay within its reporting mechanisms. So it makes it very potent and very dangerous.
Hey, let me ask you this. In another webinar I did with a colleague of mine, uh, I was talking about the impact of legacy media outlets, I and while I'm not an optimist, God knows I'm not an optimist, but I did express a little bit of hope that the diversification of the media, meaning the fact that you could go to Substack and get news directly from a journalist you trust, the fact that there's just so many more options to get your news from, and such, is actually something that at least people have an alternative where they wouldn't have had an alternative 20 years ago. Do you see any hope in terms of just the BBC becoming less relevant because there's so many other options?
Not so much because of that. No, as I said, I believe it needs dismantling from without. I think the BBC as a state broadcaster, given the power it has and the name it has, I think there will always be a market for it, and that market will be large. I'm also somewhat dubious about all of the new media that we have because it's almost information overload. There's so much out there, and we're human beings. We can only take in a certain amount of content, and we lose ourselves in basically we're drowning in a tsunami of over information.
Right.
So I have issues with that as well that are not directly related to what we're discussing now.
Okay. Something I want to ask you, as anybody who hears my accent can know, I'm not from the UK. And though I've been monitoring British media content for 15 years, I always like to ask my friends and allies in the UK about what it's like to be a Jew and be under this constant hammer from anti-Zionist activists, from outright anti-Semitic activists, from pro-terror activists, and more than that, just the degree to which, in your mind, as a British Jew, you think the BBC just fuels anti-Semitism in the UK, and how that makes you feel just on a visceral level.
I actually think that if I was to draw up a league table, I would put the BBC in second place as to the damage it has done. In first place, just so you know, is Wikipedia. Okay, I think Wikipedia is over and above everything. But when it comes to news sources, I think the BBC has spread anti-Semitism more than any other outlet. Worse than Al Jazeera even, because it's given that gold standard, it makes its reporting much more dangerous. I think it's a terrible institution at the moment.
So this is like personal for you to a large degree, correct?
Well, look, I've been fighting not just the BBC. I mean, it feels like I'm standing on a hilltop and I'm just firing in every direction at the moment. It's certainly that way in the UK, and it's a losing battle. We're not winning here. We're losing. So it doesn't matter how much we fight or how many targets we hit. It always seems to be worse. So yeah, it's very personal because look, I was born here. I was brought up as a flag waving Brit. My father, he served in the army. My grandfather served in the army. And I think since 2015, I've slowly felt the roots, my identity broken with the United Kingdom. I no longer feel British. And that's something that the last 10 years has, it's tragic. So, yeah, very, very personal.
Right. All right. First, before we get to the questions, because a lot of questions are in the queue, I do want to remind people that since you mentioned Wikipedia, that Camera had a webinar a couple of weeks ago about anti-Israel and anti-Semitic bias at Wikipedia. They can find that video on camera.org's YouTube page. I want to go to Lisa, who asked, this is a question a lot of people ask. and it's a good one. How can everyday people like us do research to fact check articles or messaging that seems that it could be inaccurate? What can people do that kind of, helps you and helps us all fight media bias?
Okay, don't overthink it. Seriously, don't overthink it. When the BBC, let's say, not just the BBC, anybody puts out an article that is reliant on a person, on a witness, on a medic, on a doctor, on a journalist, that it's not just a name on a piece of paper, it's a human being. Go look for them, because that's all we do. We go and look. It's very easy to do. You take the name, you search the name on Facebook, you find the person, you find him holding a gun or wearing a Hamas mask, and you've got yourself a story. It really is not that complicated. The best thing I think people can do, because I mean, you may feel differently because you're Cameron, you work through as well with the complaint system, which I personally don't have time. It's as a single person, the best thing to do is double check every single thing that is written on that page.
Okay. Now, Jonathan has a question. It seems generous to refer to the airing of the documentary as a mistake. It is not possible that the BBC has been deeply compromised. Sorry, is it not possible that the BBC has been deeply compromised by terror propagandists at best and at worst deliberately complicit? Given their coverage of the conflict, is it not possible that the BBC has been captured by malign actors?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's that occupation, and they are occupied. It is that occupation that creates the blindness for this to have happened. The fact that, look, I mean, nobody at the BBC, none of the executives ever thought to ask, well, actually, who is this child? Who is this child's father? And they asked the production company, and the production company blow them off, and that was enough for them. So that is more, I think, of a mindset. I've heard it described as a community of the good. Where they're in the community of the good, and the people that are working for them are in the community of the good. I, for example, would never be invited for an interview on the BBC because I'm not part of the community of the good. So there's that blindness, that naivety, which is a major part of it. And alongside that, you have the occupation, you have the infiltration of ex-Al Jazeera staffers, Islamists. Not, I mean, we've obviously got BBC Arabic as an entire system, but also within the UK, within BBC proper, there are also ex-Al Jazeera staffers. So, and it's a combination of the two that make it so toxic. Do I believe that the executives deliberately knew this was a Hamas thing and deliberately hid it? No, I don't. I think they get lost in that combination of those two issues.
Okay. You mentioned corrections, and you don't have the time and completely understand. But let me ask you this. I mean, I've often argued that merely the fact that media outlets know that we're reading every word, and that we have a social media bullhorn, and that we complain and disseminate blog posts, that the fact that they know that people like David Collier are watching those documentaries and sifting through it with a fine-tooth comb, actually, as bad as the BBC is, actually maybe it would be worse without people like David Collier. Is it fair to say? Do you think that they're definitely conscious of your presence, our presence, and that it
If
impacts
I
them
was
maybe in ways that are subconscious?
Okay, firstly, I'm not knocking the reporting mechanism. You guys do it and you do it brilliantly and you get apologies. And I think there was one published today, if I'm not mistaken, another apology I saw from Canberra. And I have myself, when I've found one or two things, I've handed them to Hadar at BB. So I tried it. I did three that were absolute nailed down errors. I tried it. It took me ages. I got knocked off and I spent so much time getting absolutely nowhere. I stopped. Do I think it makes a difference? Look, if I was a top BBC executive and I wanted to produce a documentary on Gaza, I would have phoned me or you,
Hmm.
because that would be the obvious thing for them to do. We've been at this for so long, they know we keep finding this stuff. And if they know we keep finding this stuff, then why not one of them, not at any point, turns around and say, actually, we need these guys on side because they keep seeing things we don't. And that in itself is actually a condemnation of the entire system. Why haven't they contacted anybody on our side?
Well,
So yeah,
yeah.
I think certainly they're looking over their shoulders. Certainly they're aware of us, but they should have picked up the phone.
Well, and I know you've said this before, but I think that the answer to your question is that they live in this echo chamber where they think that they're in the community of the good, right? I mean, there's a writer named Shinny Moore who wrote something in October 2023, a couple weeks after the Hamas massacre, just expressing his just astonishment at the media bias that occurred almost maybe a couple days after the massacre. And he said that there's this principle. I don't want to devolve into psychobabble, but I think this is probably understandable for most people.
Most people.
This principle called cognitive dissonance avoidance, where two facts collide. Right, your previously held beliefs about the righteousness of the Palestinian cause, regardless of what happens, and then October 7th happens, and you see in real time through GoCams, through live streaming, the torture, rape, murder, just medieval brutality, a pogrom that has no historical precedence except in the Holocaust, and that you think that that would have been a aha moment, right, a tipping point to some degree, and that people are so they hold their ideology with such a death grip that they only way that they can process that is by hating the victim more, meaning by vilifying Israel even more than they did before. Because how else can they cope with what the Palestinians did that day? Just so I guess what I'm asking you is, do you think it's like the echo chamber that they don't think that someone like David Collier has anything really to add, and they never
Yeah,
can because they're convinced of their own that they're in the community of the good, as you said.
pretty much. I actually I refer to almost a Kantian ideas of the paradigm when it comes to this, where they
Right,
are living in this paradigm, and there are events that should actually break the normal science, like October the
right.
7th, that should actually shake it to the core. But it doesn't. What they end up doing is bolting on additional theory and in an ever convoluted manner of nonsense. And the way that it's basically played out since October the 7th is Hamas are alien invaders.
Hmm.
There's about 19 Hamas terrorists in the entire Gaza Strip. They're alien invaders. They're nothing to do with the Palestinians at all. And and this is the way the reporting is working. And a second strand is the fact that everything is justifiable. There is no way to read the reporting that comes out of the BBC without grasping that they believe that the Palestinians have no choice but to resist.
Hmm.
You know,
So
it,
they're
it,
they're
it's
denied agency. They're not
yeah,
assigned agents.
it's written, it's in the small print. It's so when we come along and we say, hey, that guy is Hamas, you know, or they look at it, well, he's an alien, and he's nothing to do with the Palestinians anyway. And those people that have died around him, they're not actually family members, they're innocent civilians. Um, or they're turning around and they're saying, well, what do you expect them to do? You are
Hmm.
effectively the demon state. You are doing all of this. You have this long history of oppression. We can't really sanction the Palestinians for resisting. And it's a combination of these different ideas that are driving the narrative on the BBC website.
Okay. David and Sylvia want to ask about the movement to refuse paying the license. Do you have any? I don't want you to say anything that'll get you in trouble or me in trouble, but I mean, there certainly seems to be the campaign against anti-Semitism is I believe campaigning to
Right.
for a policy that's going to remove the license fee. But what do you think
Yeah,
about
we
the whole? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say let's be careful about CAA because CAA are a charity, and CAA wouldn't do anything that would step on over the mark. So let's. I don't want to describe what they do or what they're not doing. You know, I- I want to leave CAA out of it for that, just to protect them. I believe firmly that no Jewish person should pay the license fee. You
Okay.
know, I believe firmly that no person who is sane should pay the license fee. I actually think that the movement, or not the movement, but the number of people in the United Kingdom who would refuse to pay the license fee if they actually knew the truth would dwarf the issues we had with the rates, decades ago with Thatcher, where they started doing the different rates in the rooms and we had the big protests. I actually think that the British public would stop paying if they knew the truth. So I'm firmly in favour of not paying. I don't think anyone who is sane should pay. And the sooner people realise it, the better.
Okay. Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify. Maybe it didn't come out clearly, but what I was getting at, as far as charities in the UK, I think they're calling for the government to scrap the license fee. They're not calling for anyone to break
Okay.
the law. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Fine.
Okay. Yeah,
Fine.
thanks for
Yeah.
making that clear. Now I understand you have
Yeah.
to be careful with your charity, but thanks for your views on that. Um, so a lot of people also want to know, and I know this is really hard to, it's one of the hardest questions to answer, and that is, to what degree is biased reporting motivated by the anti-Semitic views of the reporters? Is it more kind of like this post-colonial ideological motivation? Just I'm sure you spend time in your research hours thinking about this. So, you don't have to name people, but I'm saying in general, I always try to be very nuanced when I answer. It depends on who we're talking about. It depends on whether there is a paper trail on social media where you can catch them actually expressing anti-Semitic thoughts per the IRA definition. But where do you come down on this?
Right, firstly, yeah, I do. I spend many hours like scratching my head. That's where all the hair has gone, just wondering about what's going on. But I actually did, and I'll mention it because I think it's relevant, even if it's not the entire answer. I did some research into Sheffield Council. I think they were one of the first councils to put the Palestinian flag up on the town hall. This was years back. And I said, well, what's going on inside this council? So I looked, and you look around the council table, and you've got your aging white British lefty types. You've got the Bangladeshis and people with Pakistani heritage. You've got a few Somalian, like people with Somali, and it's such a mix. And you think, well, there's nothing these people can agree on except one thing.
Hmm.
The only conversation these people can have is about Palestine. Even if they start talking about Kashmir, it will annoy the Indians in the room. So
Hmm.
it's us, which is one of the reasons that we are an obsessive part of. In other words, it's default almost that we become the obsessive conversation. Um, but look, yes, anti-Semitism is absolutely a driver. Without a shadow of a doubt, if there was no anti-Semitism, we wouldn't be in this mess. We really wouldn't. Another issue we have is obviously with the rise of the Islamist ideology within media reporting, not just in media reporting, but in the councils and basically across the United Kingdom. And it is a combination of these factors that makes it feel like, it's a tsunami we're living through. It's not just the one and it's not the other, it's several factors here that are working to create basically what's a perfect storm.
Okay. But you've actually written a lot of posts about the influence of radicalism, of Islamism in the UK, and the impact that has on society, the impact that has on Jewish life, the impact that has on the media. Um, you know, uh, it it seems like in some media outlets are comfortable reporting on it, like the Telegraph, for instance, sometimes the Times. Um, do you think it's got, in my kind of non-empirical measure, it seems like it's gotten more play recently? That people are more willing to talk about the threat posed by radical Islamists. There was that story about that refugee that came on that small boat, and that Camera UK, our Arabic team, was able to find that he called to kill all Jews, and that got a lot of attention. Do you think there's a little bit more of an openness to talk about that problem, or is it still kind of taboo?
Yeah, it's very much taboo. What's happening is there's a societal battle taking place. I mean, we can talk, for example, about the riots we had last year. After the brutal murder of those poor girls in Southport, where it was pushed online that it was a Muslim person that had done it, and it wasn't, and we had riots on the streets. A few weeks after that, there was a kidnapping that we now know took place in Wales, where an Israeli was
Right.
taken to Wales. It made no noise whatsoever. In fact, as far as I can see, it was put out only on a local BBC channel. BBC Wales wasn't indexed on the rest of the websites because they wanted to keep it, they were scared of the reaction. Um, we've got a government at the moment that is pushing left, right, and centre. We have now the APPG, the All Party Group of for Muslims. We've got the question now about whether or not the MCB will be brought on board. We've got this new British Muslim Network group. We've got the questions now about the Islamophobia definition. The Labour Party is running scared of losing the Muslim vote. It's politically in trouble. It knows it's in trouble. It suffered setbacks where they were surprised to receive setbacks in the last election. I mean, forget the illusion of a massive win. It wasn't that big a win, really. The right-wing vote was split. I'm not going to go into the complexities now.
Right.
Labour would be concerned about what's going to happen at the next election. They would certainly be concerned if the Muslim vote, which took 4 seats, grows and starts affecting others. They've got one of their key ministers, Wes Streeting, narrowly, very narrowly won against Liane Mohammed. So there are all of these things going on with a government, therefore, that is going to be very sympathetic
Right.
towards the Muslim population. So is it going to come up against the Islamists? No, I don't think it will. I just don't think it will.
Okay, we have a friend of ours. I think you know Sammy Stein. He wants to know. This is a good question. Is there even one BBC reporter who provides stories from the Middle East that you feel is balanced? Can you name one?
Yeah, I probably firstly, Sammy. Hi, Sammy. I'll see you in Glasgow in a couple of months. It's their 10th anniversary, I believe, at Glasgow Friends. So I'll be there to
Yeah.
celebrate with them. Really good guys. Look, I'll be honest. I don't care about putting myself in the firing line. Like you asked me a question about, the license fee, and I'll happily turn around and say I don't think anyone should pay. Would I feel comfortable naming, if I name a specific journalist, am I putting that person in the firing line? So
Hmm. That's
I'd
interesting.
rather. Oh, look, I had a call a couple of months ago from, because of what I do, I have people turning to me. So I had a call from a BBC journalist, a female, a couple of months ago. She's in tears, absolutely in tears. Jewish, facing the new environment that she's facing. I know other Jews within the BBC that feel the same. So this is the toxic environment these people are now working in. I will protect them by not putting any names on the table.
Protect them. That's thank you. That's a very interesting answer. I didn't think about that angle, and that makes a lot of sense. It's a question that we get about the Guardian, but I never thought of it that way. All right, so someone wants to know, and this is a big question, and I want to set this up. Before when Jeremy Corbyn was running to become prime minister, I think the first time, I think it was 2000. Was it 2017 the first election? Right, I think.
The election, he took over
He
in
became leader in
2015. The
2015.
election was 2017. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a poll done, I believe, by the Jewish Chronicle that showed a staggering number of Jews thought that if Corbyn would become prime minister, that they would seek out lives elsewhere outside the UK. And there was if you remember, there was a joint editorial by 3 Jewish newspapers that Corbyn represented an existential threat to British Jews. I guess the question is, and this is huge, but just, I'm sure you've thought about this. Do you think Jews have a future in the UK?
Okay. A couple of things. Firstly, I get asked that question every time I speak at a synagogue. It's like it's
Okay.
the one question. Secondly, you talk about Corbyn, and it's funny. I look back now as the good old days. You know, we thought we had a problem with Corbyn.
Right.
Little did we know what was coming around the corner. Look, sadly, again, it's the pessimist in me talking. I think we're in deep trouble. I don't think individually we're in existential danger. I think Jews, I don't think we're about to, get dragged off and put into a camp somewhere. I
Right.
think as a community, we're in existential danger. Um, The Orthodox amongst us, the Haredim, they'll be fine. They'll carry on doing what they do. They'll live in Stamford Hill or in Canvey Island or wherever they are, and it won't really matter what's taking place around them. You know that. But for the Jewish community, the Board of Deputies Jewish community, you know, the Hendons and the Finchleys and the Golders Greens and you know, of Manchester, what we have in Manchester and so on, I think they're in real trouble. And I think what we're seeing as well is on the one hand, we're seeing people turn around and say, maybe we should move to Israel, maybe we should go to America, maybe we should find somewhere else to go. But on the other hand, we're seeing the alternative, which is Jews finding comfort in the fact that they can be Jewish here. Nobody and everyone will leave them alone if they just attack Israel.
Hmm.
So, yeah, certainly amongst the youth. So we're seeing that develop in ways that I'd never, you know, I used to laugh at it 10, 15 years ago because they were tiny and they were a fringe. They're not tiny and they're not a fringe anymore. You know, certainly not amongst the younger people. Um, so yeah, I'm deeply concerned that we're letting, I mean, my children went to a Jewish faith school. They learned more about Islam than they did about Zionism, Judaism, or Israel. You know, that's what they
Right.
learned at school, and that's just wrong. Our children need to be. We need to put a Zionist spine in our children, because if we don't, we will lose them.
Yeah, there was a writer, I forget who, that talked about the need for a spinal infusion, I think was the word.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. We need it. You know, I often say to people, you can be Jewish, you know, as religiously or nationally. And you can be Jewish in any part of the spectrum as religiously or nationally as you want, or any combination of the two. But if you are not Jewish religiously and you are not Jewish nationally, you have nothing to sell your children. Nothing. You give them some kind of tikkun olam utopian thing that's no different from Christianity, you're not going to be able to hold on to them.
Yeah, I mean, just to get personal for a second, you know, one of the reasons I made Aliyah was because I wanted to get married and raise children that were going to be Jewish, right? To pass down my identity. And not that I'm recommending anybody who doesn't want to do to make Aliyah, but certainly, you know, making Aliyah is a vaccine, a chisun against an eroding Jewish identity. Yeah. All right. Let's
100%
let's
agree.
get
100%.
let's get back to Sammy Simons. He's a star in my mind, and he has the follow-up question. He said, "Isn't it frightening that you were concerned about naming a journalist that at the BBC who's good?" And yes, it's frightening, but he says, "Can you just are there some?" He just wants to know, can you give us a percentage? Are
Yeah.
there 2%, 5%?
No,
He's really
look,
curious.
absolutely. Absolutely, there are good people in the BBC. The BBC is a massive institution. It's massive, and it has been overrun by bad guys. And it has a mindset that is liberal and progressive and woke, and it has been pretty much taken over by a core of activists, journalists, Islamists, and so on. But that doesn't mean there aren't good people at the Guardian. Of course, there are. You know, I can't tell you as much. I mean, it's not just the protection thing. It's also I can't tell you as much as I do know, even because it's not for public consumption. But yes, it's firstly it's tragic. I cannot name the names. Tragic, absolutely. I mean, that's the world we live in. I cannot tell you the name of a good Jewish journalist because Asa Winstanley, Electronic Intifada, and his hound dogs, they'll go after them. So you know, so yeah, it's tragic.
But you know, even someone like Rafi Berg is like hounded by virtue of just being a Jewish journalist at the BBC, right? Like whatever you say about his journalism, like he's hounded just because he's Jewish and he is responsible for content in the Middle East department.
Yeah, and
That
I would imagine he's in a really difficult position with a really difficult job. And Rafi, yes, I mean Rafi was obviously picked on by Owen Jones and the like. Um, I you know again, yes, I mean this is typical of the story where you have someone who's Jewish who's not anti-Israel as such. He's not, you know, he's not waving the Palestinian flag. Because of that, he becomes a target.
okay. Another question. Someone wants to know what your thoughts are. Although I think I can imagine what your thoughts are about BBC Verify, their fact checking unit.
No, and I have a basic problem with the BBC. With firstly, waste of money. Forget Israel. BBC Verify, waste of money. What do they think they're doing? That's not what BBC is about. That's not what it should be about. Secondly, the BBC have a fundamental agency problem. Okay, it's a really bad agency problem, and by that I mean this. Okay, so take I think Merlin Thomas. Now she's one of the BBC Verify crew. Now she may be a perfectly decent journalist doing a perfectly decent job with perfectly decent intent. And she gets told to do this report in BBC Verify because she's part of the Verify team. But she doesn't speak Hebrew. Her understanding of Gazan society is probably zilch. Her
Right.
Arabic is unlikely to be fluent, which means she totally becomes dependent on somebody within the BBC who speaks Arabic as a native language, who is well connected in Gaza, who has all of the fixers and runners and so on. In other words, she's turning to BBC Arabic for help. And it probably means behind the scenes, very few articles on Gaza don't have BBC Arabic DNA inside them somewhere. If you want a perfect example about how this works, we can look at the documentary. The documentary had two producers. One producer comes along with his award-winning documentaries and his skill set, and I'm sure that he's a pretty good producer. But he doesn't speak Arabic, or at least I don't think he does. He doesn't understand the conflict. On October the 7th, he posted something about the Ukraine. So he was so disinterested in the conflict. It's like someone on 9/11 posting something about Slovakia. If you didn't post anything at all on that, but you did post something else. So you were online, you chose to post something, and it had nothing to do with what was taking place in Gaza. He's completely disinterested. The other half of the duo is a Palestinian from Gaza. So it's a complete imbalance in the situation, and that's the problem with BBC Verify. You can't possibly, unless you go into this understanding that this is a problem, that you can't trust what you're being told, that Hamas have control over editorial output in Gaza. Unless you go in with all of those sitting firmly in your mind, you will end up being a Hamas puppet. And that's what happens with BBC Verify.
Okay. Which brings me to another question. I don't have the person's name in front of me, but someone watching wants to know whether you think Israel made a strategic mistake by not allowing foreign journalists to enter Gaza.
No, I don't. I think it's a red herring of a story, if you ask me. How many Western journalists were with Saddam Hussein's forces? How many Western journalists were with Assad's forces? How many Western journalists are on the front line with the Russian forces? That's not the way this works. This is a situation where we have a conflict. We have a terrorist group that is basically using 1.7 million or 1.8 million people there as cattle, as hostage. They don't care how many people get killed. Giving them, if we give them, let's say 100 journalists go in, we let 100 journalists, what are they going to do? They're not going to be with the Hamas fighters. They're not going to be looking for the rockets. They're not going to be looking for the hostages. What exactly are they going to do? All they're going to do is become audience for Hamas pantomimes put on by the civilians a long way from whatever. It's a nonsense. And adding to that, when this conflict started, the BBC had a team in Gaza. It flew them out for their safety. So it's a bit, crazy for the BBC to turn around and say, well, actually, we just wish there were people there, when they did have people there, but they flew them out. And the other half of the BBC, that BBC propaganda documentary, was in Gaza as well. He also was flown out. So I don't buy into it at all. I don't think it was a strategic. I think it's a red herring.
Okay, and that's a good pivot to another question by someone we know, Lawrence Julius. He wants to know, can you please comment on the BBC's pre-war bureau in Gaza and its involvement with Hamas?
What was the name again? Lawrence Julius?
Lawrence Julius.
Yeah, another good friend, I think. Hi, Lawrence. If it's the right one anyway. Look, uh, I everything in Gaza is a certain stage removed from Hamas, or Islamic Jihad. So if we want to talk, for example, and I'll use Al Jazeera as an example. Al Jazeera's head of their bureau, uh, Al Wado, or whatever his name is, his entire family is Islamic Jihad. He spent time. He's the head of the Al Jazeera bureau in Gaza. He spent time in Israeli jail during the first Intifada. His uncle committed a terrorist attack in 1993 in Tel Aviv. His brother was killed as an Islamic Jihad terrorist in 2002. Two of his uncles ran the military for the Islamic Jihad. Every year, up until about 2017 or 18, the Islamic Jihad would hold this big ceremony for the
Hmm.
family because there were so many martyrs. I think it's about 25 or 26 from that particular family. The BBC are not so stupid, right? So that's Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera just, they'd employ anyone. But it still holds true. You don't get to be in a position of import in Gaza unless your clan is somehow connected to one of the leading clans in the strip.
Right.
And the only way those clans are going to be at the head of anything is from association with the terrorist groups. Everybody else is a nobody. So anybody, it doesn't matter whether you're in a BBC article, they're talking about the director of a hospital or the owner of this. So they're all connected through their clans because that's all this is. It's a clan-based society. And the primary thing that people have to understand when they're talking about Gaza is they're talking about a clan-based society. It's almost like a caste system. And
Hmm.
the only
Interesting.
people we see on screens are the people that are connected one way or another to the terrorist groups.
Yeah. Uh, Running a little out of time, but there's a few more questions I want to try to answer. Derek Sacker wants to know: is it not true that BBC News or BBC Arabic that their biggest advertiser outside the UK is Qatar? Is that true?
I'm not actually. I'm not actually sure about that. I tell you what, since documentaries come out, I've received dozens of emails with hundreds of pages of documents that I haven't even begun to go through. On the BBC charity arm, not the BBC, but the BBC charity arm,
Right. Right.
which yeah, and that's if anywhere, that's how it's happening. So I don't want to turn around and say yes, they're the biggest funders, but I am saying that it's not as simple as people think. The BBC are not just operating with our license fee, nor are they just operating under the BBC arm. They have other things going on that allow them to do things that our state broadcaster shouldn't necessarily be doing. And
Because
there is obviously opportunity for funding.
okay. Okay, a couple other questions that people are asking. We get this a lot, and I think I know what my answer is, but I'll let you answer it. Is there any chance that in some future world the BBC will release the Ballon report?
Actually, I was just reading something on that. Tim Llewellyn, I think, posted on Electronic Intifada that he had it and he'd read it, and it doesn't say what we think it says. Um, I'll be honest, I don't think personally, and I don't fight that corner, and I'll tell you why. Because it could backfire. What I want, I know what the BBC is like today. And what I want is I want an investigation and an independent and fully transparent investigation today that will be published and let everybody see exactly what's going on. I don't know what was in the Ballon report. And today, it may be right. There may have been really damning things in there that they didn't want published. But I don't know. And I wouldn't put too many eggs in that basket. What we should be fighting for today is a today investigation.
Right. Plus, that was released what 20 years ago, right? I mean, that
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
published 20 years ago.
So also as well, I mean, I don't know how much these things can get to the truth. Let's say one happens today, they're not going to talk about the Islamist problem. because it's not politically correct to do so, and it's not politically sellable, and they'll have instructions from absolutely everybody, don't go down that rabbit hole. So even if we get one today, it's still, so I don't know in what environment it was written, what the, what shaped it. And so, yeah, it was a long time ago. And again, we need to fight for one today because our problem is now.
Right. Someone wants to know about whether you think Tim Davies should be fired and whether that would have an impact.
I don't know if it have an impact. I think heads should roll, but what I don't want is scapegoats. I
Okay.
really don't. This isn't about a person. It really isn't. And I don't think we should turn it into something. Oh, so we get rid of him and then we bring in someone new. It will be the same. This is an institutional and systemic problem. And what I don't want to do is to get fooled or distracted by a BBC that comes out with some kind of oh yeah, we're sorry and we fired these two people. No, thank you very much.
Okay. Someone asked about NPR, National Public Radio, and which is funded by U.S. taxpayers, and I think wants to know if there's a comparison, and I can answer that by saying there's no comparison because a tiny number of people listen to NPR and PBS. I mean, the BBC is global, like I said, they publish in 40 different languages. So while our organization does monitor NPR and they are certainly biased, they don't have the impact of the BBC. The reason why I think so many people are interested in the BBC is because of their literally global reach, and that is funded by taxpayers. Let me ask you this. Can you give us a sneak preview of anything you're working on that might blow up in a week?
Well, I'll be honest. I mean, ever since this came out, I've been looking at Channel 4.
Okay.
And the reason I'm looking at Channel 4 is that they've got some more. I mean, there's something that stinks to high heaven, and that's Hamash. The co-producer for this documentary, he was from Channel 4. And Channel 4 won these awards. But before I need to go through, I've already found some of the stuff by going through the Channel 4 documentaries and their news broadcasts. Abdullah turned up 3 times. We've got a few other people that shouldn't be there. So I'm looking at that. I can't, but you know what this is like. You can spend days, if not weeks, going down rabbit holes and come out empty-handed. So I don't know, but there are a few things I'm working on at the moment. Channel 4 is the one with the breadcrumbs on my desk.
Okay, and I can certainly vouch. I mean, to the degree that I monitor Channel 4 and post about them, that they're kind of underrated for how biased they are. I mean, they kind of don't get the same, their content isn't amplified as much as the BBC, but their content about Israel since October 7th, and even before, has been really, really, really bad. And they're also very difficult complaint process, and that's something that I'm glad actually to hear that you're looking more at them. So I think they deserve more critical scrutiny.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it's again bringing it back to the BBC. These organisations are just the sum of their parts. That's all they are. And the BBC has been employing people, bringing in journalists that woke, left wing, these kinds, or from Channel 4, or from Al Jazeera. You can only employ so many of these people before you start to look like them.
Right.
This will be your output, and that's what's being over a generation now, decades. This is
Okay.
what we've been witnessing at the BBC.
Okay, one last question. What can people do who want to support you, who want to help you, who want to be on Team Collier?
Just basically, look, the money side I always leave to one side because I am community funded, but I always just follow me, just retweet stuff, repost stuff. That's all,
Okay.
That's Team Collier.
Well, okay. Cool. All right. So we've been on Team Collier for a long time. We appreciate the work you do. You're a fantastic researcher, and thanks very much for coming on and for helping our audience understand the problems of the BBC. All right, so thanks very much. For those of you that wish to support CAMERA's programs, you can donate to us by going to camera.org and clicking the link for the donate link. I also recommend you follow us on our social media platforms, including Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and I think I might be forgetting one other, because we really count on both on donations from those of us who like our content, but also liking our content, for promoting our content on social media. So that's where the conversation is, as David said. So thanks very much for joining us, and have a good day.